Okay, so this is the second part of my presentation on, so let's see. So, yeah, I don't know, I'll try to do maybe a short recap, at least of the model, the formal model I introduced to model interactions. But yeah, so last time we discussed quite in detail the school occupations movement in 2015 in São Paulo. And then I also got to present this model of social interaction, right? Let me just remind you like the objectives I had put in the beginning, just so you have an idea of where things are going. So we covered this first thing, which is the model for social and political interaction. Then for today, I mean, the idea is to cover these three other parts, which is I'll start from the third one actually, which is try to think about this idea of what a boundary is in political movements. So I put it like this, like it's an attempt to think the separation of political bodies and the social world, the complementary relation between the interiority of a political movement and its boundary, and of its boundary to the exteriority of the state and the capital and the social world. This, rather than thinking politics solely as a contradiction between two objective terms, like workers and capital, or as a pure subjective interiority. So this is the part, this is the next part, and then, but also to delineate some elements of a political economy of social struggle that is the means of reproduction and production from the standpoint of a political body or movement, rather than of capital. And then the last part, it will deal with the question of political experiments and this idea of residues and what does it mean to learn something with in a political sequence, like the problem of the historicity of political sequences. So that is to think the historicity of political bodies, its sequential character, as a process of experimentation and inquiry, a treatment of residues rather than as a matter of a program or some sort of like class objectivity, or of a progressive accumulation. And this within that model that I had introduced, or using that model as a sort of formal space to sort of develop these ideas. So just to quickly like summarize how that framework works. So it tries to study sort of like objects, entities, from the point of view of how they interact with each other, and from there be able to infer how these entities relate themselves in terms of parthood and who's a part of what, who, yeah, to infer a bit less sort of like mereological description of a situation in which you have some political movement which is trying to sort of like grow or develop, and the social world which is reacting and also dealing with this movement. So so the example I started with is you have a family, and then you have like a dad, a mom, and a son, and you can ask questions if there's a divorce, so there's some sort of like break with between the parents. We can sort of like study the dynamics of this story by asking how these terms interact, with whether the dad can interact with the son in a meaningful way, whether the mom interacts with the son, and whether the son is a common part of this couple, or if it sides with one of the sides, and this sort of thing. So in the model itself, we basically represent the objects, the elements, by this letters. And then we have arrows which connect these objects. And we're basically interested in asking whether there are closed paths, which closed paths exist that start from a given entity and goes back to it. So, for example, whether the dad can interact with, maybe it cannot interact directly anymore with the mother of the, but it can via the son because it has a good relationship to the son. So the notation is basically the bottom term is the starting node, and then on the top you see the sort of like the mediations that can be used to unfold this sort of like closed loop. So in this case, IDAC means the composition of this arrow H and K that goes back to A. And this other term, IDAC to B, means the closed path that is the composition of H, J, and G. So yeah, it's just to remind a bit, and for people who wasn't here.
One question: How do you distinguish again if IDACBA goes H, J, then from B back to C and C back to A, rather than the G arrow?
Yeah, I use a forward and backward arrow.
Okay.
So you had the question, right? So so this term is ACBA, so H, J, G, and this double arrow means it comes back through C also.
I see. Okay.
I think there maybe could be interesting ways of disentangling this to the interpretation of this. I'm not sure. So this led basically to an analysis of the symmetry or asymmetry of these interactions, right? So in case of two kids, they could be a common part. They could play with a toy and sort of, and because they can both symmetrically interact with the toy and get a sort of feedback from the other kid, and they both do that, the toy is a common part. We say that the toy is a common part. While in asymmetric interactions, where just one of the terms can interact with the third one via a certain second term, when you have this asymmetry, we say that there's not a relationship of commonhood, but of inclusion, of asymmetric inclusion. So yeah, but I don't have to go too much into details. It's just sort of to refresh the mind. I'll start with an example to sort of discuss, which is, so yeah, so let's start with this idea of the boundary. I came across, I think on Twitter, with this poem, which gives, I think, the sort of vibe of the problem, which is basically, I think, this idea that in any struggle, you have a certain region of a political movement in which things are sort of at stake, and it's a question of sort of the expansion or the development of the movement towards the world, the whole world, right? There's a sort of process of incorporation of new material and new elements into a political movement. And I think this poem is cool for that. But yeah, I think I'll start this discussion of borders with this example of the role of unions in history. So we can use a bit, I think, this model I started to introduce to sort of distinguish the different. So instead of just describing like in a static way what a union is, one way I think to approach is to assess in a given situation how workers and, on the other side, like for example, capital or the state interact with a union in order to get meaningful, sort of get effective effects. And that interaction. So we could distinguish maybe three ways of sort of answering the question of whether a union is on the side of workers, or it's actually like a mechanism of it's part of the state, or whether it's just an instrument of capital, for example. So in this model, if these identities exist, so if the workers can use the union in order to get back some sort of like a consequence, some political gain from capital, which they wouldn't otherwise be able to, like by just directly relating. So the presence of these arrows, so both the self arrow, which sort of just self-relate the workers via some sort of like delegation or space where workers can coordinate. So this is more internal dimension, but also the more external one, in which the union becomes a sort of organ to sort of produce effects, to have a more like coordinated strike and this sort of thing. In this case, we can say that the union is part of the workers because of the existence of these functions. If on the other hand, you can sort of evaluate that not only these identities exist, but there's also like a complementary identity in which it is capital that can use unions to sort of, by example, by picking certain representatives or leaders, instead of not being able to interact with workers, which are like in a wildcat strike, just picking something in which it can sort of like the space of the union to sort of negotiate and negotiate like the end of a strike. In this sense, when there's this symmetry, you suddenly have a symmetric relationship of use of the union, and that in that case, you can either say that the union is a common part of the workers and capital, or there could be at some point that the workers can't even use. So they, for example, they might do wildcat strikes because they have no trust. There's no use in going to the unions anymore. So in this case, you have a asymmetric relationship for the other side, right? So, and then there's, I think, a third case in which we consider the functions of reproduction and of effective sort of like interaction of the union itself to the other terms. So there are like analyses which treat the development of unions as sort of extended apparatus of the state, like that the unions that are like a case of the emergence of a class of managers, of bureaucrats of the state, which function to sort of it's like a third class, which would point to like the union not being only a part of say the workers of capital, but being explained by an autonomous sort of logic on itself. So in this case, it is the workers and capital which also are part of the reproduction of the union. So the idea is that by analyzing this in like concrete situations, the sort of arrows that obtain, you can sort of start thinking about which objects in a certain situation are sort of internal or are under dispute or are sort of lost to the other side, and this sort of thing. So so this starts to point a bit to this idea of the boundary, which is that in certain regions of a certain situation, there are objects which are sort of midway between the social world and the movement, which I'll call the boundary. Whereas there are certain objects which we can say that are internal, that there is no there's no direct sort of relationship that the social world has with that. So in the case of the case study for last time, we could say that the occupations were part of the interior of the movement, like whatever happened inside an occupation, a school occupation, is sort of protected by the boundary of the movement to direct. So it's not the police couldn't enter in the occupation in a quite like literal sense, right? So because of the fact that the police couldn't enter and directly like manage the occupation or even like organized like parents, even the left couldn't completely like directly control the interior of an occupation. This sort of filtering by a boundary sort of gives the character of this interiority of the space, whereas there are regions of the movement in which, for example, the example I gave was at the walls outside of the occupation, in which lots of like journalists, police, the students, the organized collectives sort of mingle and try to sort of dispute and negotiate, but also try to expand and think about the next step beyond the sort of internal logic of the occupation. So
yeah, one thing I can maybe also add and clarify, I think also the exterior, we want to definitely associate it like pretty directly with the negation of the interior because of how we're spatializing logics as well. So like that makes it like a lot more clear and connected to more like Hegelian type.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
I sort of in the process of making, I tried to define, I think the closest I got maybe to this idea of negation was I actually was using it some, so let me just, this idea of the subtracted space, I think tries to do a bit of that. So so exactly. So you can sort of like think about the objects that I think there's a mistake here. There shouldn't be this cross. So we can given two objects. I'll detail way better like this what the boundary and the interior is. It's just to have a general intuition, which to me came a bit by thinking of this idea of Badiou of thinking negation in terms of subtraction and not of a mere like simple destruction, but thinking about like spaces that are sort of at a distance, which are on one hand an interior, but sort of negates are at a distance from the exterior of the space, right? So here I'm defining. So this is the symbol for boundary, and this is the symbol for interior. I forgot to say that. So we can always ask whether there are objects which are a common part. So given these two objects, if there exists these two identities, so here it's wrong, we can say that whatever is here function as a sort of common space of interaction of these two objects, right? So it's the objects X which play the role of the symmetric interaction between O1 and O2. And I think if and then reciprocally, like the complementary part of that would be I was maybe call it inclusion space or subtracted space, which is when you don't have the symmetry, right? So the objects which there is one of the identities but not the other, and I think it makes a difference whether these objects are. So one thing I'm thinking is that whether if these objects are sort of say inside of an occupation, they are there are common spaces of the movement, right? There's some space where cooperation can sort of emerge. But when you have objects which are in the boundary, the presence of the symmetry of interaction between the exterior and the interior is a place which by definition is a sort of integration or sort of like recognition space in which something is being exchanged in a symmetric way. While if you think about these asymmetric relationships inside the movements or in an occupation, you can treat this, I don't know, in some term of like delegation of some delegation process, like the process of forming commissions and this kind of stuff. While when you have a asymmetric sort of like relationship at the boundary, then it means that there's something, I think, that's being disputed, right? The direction of this interaction. So normally in boundary, like at the boundary of movements, you get the problems of integration versus conflict, right? Whilst inside, say, of an occupation, it's much more of a matter of sort of delegating, finding the right balance of sort of horizontal relations and sort of delegation of functions and this kind of stuff. Yeah, so now I wanted to just discuss a little bit more formally this idea of what a topological space, which is something quite new to me, but it's actually, I think, quite intuitive what a space is. So a topology is basically a space. So you have a given, a topology is basically a collection of, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong at some point, but it's basically a collection of subsets you define over a certain set, right? So, and to be a topology, you basically need to satisfy these three properties. So always the empty set is part of the topology, and also the full set is part of the topology. And you should be able to sort of, given two elements of the topology, you can always do finite intersections and get a subset which is also part of the topology. And you can also do arbitrary, which means like infinite unions between elements of the topology. So these two properties of given like two regions of space, you can always ask for what's the intersection between the spaces and what's the union of the spaces. Gives you the power of sort of being able to localize stuff in the space.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that with just these axioms, if you have basically like the right topology chosen, which is like the right level of sort of like detail at which you can measure localness within some arbitrary set, that these rules are basically enough to do like stretchy geometry. What I mean by that is like geometry minus measurement. So it doesn't have like a notion of measurement or size built into it, but it is enough to give spaces, and here spaces we're like associating with logical spaces as well.
I think a good way of saying that is that with this, if you guarantee these things, you guarantee that things are connected. Like you get from one place to another. You just don't know how long it takes from one place to another.
Yeah, maybe they don't have to be connected necessarily, but it's a language for getting between parts of your space and moving between parts of your space, between subsets and in terms of how they intersect and stuff. And yeah, I guess we went into a lot of this earlier, of like the connections here with logic and with basically like constructive logic that excludes the law of the excluded middle, but that's not relevant for now.
Yeah, and what is really cool is that, I mean, at least to me, is that you're able to localize stuff. So say, for example, this point P, just by being able to point out like this regions of the topology and saying, okay, it's in the intersection of these three like regions, you get your point is sort of there. So you can sort of talk some notion of closeness without defining some sort of metric of the space. So, right, in the topology, you're able to talk about stuff that is close without talking about necessarily defining a metric of the space.
Yeah, so generally, like if you start with just a topology like that, point ends up getting defined not by its pointedness necessarily, but by the way that it's the intersections of every of these open sets that we can identify that contain the point. So that, yeah.
And so there are many ways, which is something that's also cool, in which you can actually axiomatize, right, what a topology is. You can use as primitive many different concepts. So here we're using like open sets, I think, as the sort of like primitive notion. But we can also, there's a related concept which can also be used as a primitive to introduce a topological space, which is that of closure. So a closure, the closure of a set is basically the set of points which are close to the set B, in the sense that given any point in a set B, if you look at the neighborhood, how do you say, like, if a point is what?
Oh yeah, I said one good thing that clarifies a neighborhood is any open set, so any of these sets that we identify which contain that point, right?
Yeah. So I think one way to think about is that, so given a set B, you want to know which points are close. The points which are close is when if you look around that point, you sort of necessarily intersect with the original set B, right? So there's no way, if you're in the closure of a set B, there's no way, if you're a point of the closure, that you look around yourself and you don't see, and you don't intersect minimally with the set B. So just by using this notion of intersection, you're able to talk about closeness without ever talking about a distance. So this to me was like something that I thought was changes a lot the way you think about spaces. But in any case, I'm talking about closure just to introduce the notions we were talking, which is that of an interior and of a boundary. So so the interior of a set is the set of points in which, whenever you look at the neighborhood around that point, the whole neighborhood is inside the regional set, right? So you're in the.
There should be anyone where there exists some small enough neighborhood. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you're able to always look around and you're always inside, you're as included in the set, then you're in the interior of it, right? There's no way. So if you're in the interior of the space, you always look around and you're inside the space. That's basically what.
I think Efren asked for an example of political bodies, and I think it might be helpful just to, like, since the occupations are very spatial as well, right? I think perhaps just going back to that as to give an example of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I guess in an occupation, like, the way that you could think is, if you're inside the occupation and you look around, you're always trivially, you're sort of like inside the movement, right? While if you're in the street, like just at the wall, the outside of the school, if you look around, you're not necessarily like inside the movement. You might be the police, you might be, like, you can be many things. You might be inside, but you might be outside of the movement. So the closure would be like the inside of the occupation plus the sort of like walls of the occupation.
Just one point, just to clarify something, because perhaps this context is relevant to clarify why this is useful, not just trivial, because a big topic in the occupations in Brazil, and I think I'm not sure if in the Occupy movement in the States was similar, but the question of where the limit where the boundary was a big political dispute. So for example, you had schools closed by students, like with chairs blocking the way in. But outside you had like leftist political parties, friendly journalists, but their position was, so it's not spatial only, it's political in the sense that are those political parties part of the school student movement, or are they not part of it? This was a big issue, right? So I don't think that's trivial, like it's not everywhere that, you know, it's not simply that on the other side of barricades, you're outside. So it just the geographical logic already accounts for the political logic. And the occupations here, sure, the interior is easy to see because it was interior of the schools, but it's not trivial what was happening at the border of the schools. It was partially inside because there were leftist parties or leftist militants who were helping in some way, even student unions, teachers unions who were meaningfully helping, but they were also kind of in a different logic. So it's not just geographical, it's actually, we're talking about the topology of the interaction, the political interactions, right? Does that make sense, Efren?
Yeah, that's an important point, because the example of the occupation is sort of, it's almost too, because it falls too nicely in sort of physical, geographical borders. It leads you to think that is merely like a spatial, in a sort of physical, right, description. But if you think about like the real interior of the occupation movement is not like the occupation as interior. It was a continue, like it was a moment. But what was like an invariant interior of the movement was this being a student, right? So that's why it was really important for the movement to sort of maintain this. So it wasn't like a movement of, say, university students and high school students and all students. It was like a specifics, and it wasn't like a movement of organized leftist students also. It was important that the criteria for example, entering the occupation was being a student and not a parent, not an organized leftist, not anything. And this sort of like filtering was able to constitute this sort of subjective interiority of what a student was, right? And that had sort of like tactical implications of like preserving the integrity of the occupation, but also like in a subjective sense, it meant that the students could also like exist in a sort of like political way, right? They weren't reducible to like a leftist movement or I don't know, like, yeah, students in general.
And I think that another way of, I mean, I think the greatest example or challenge for this that we have in Brazil right now, it's also something Renzo wrote about, which is the Courier Strike, which is much more dispersed, like the courier movements against like platforms and so on, because you can see it's a very dispersed kind of process. So it's not spatially clear, but still the problem of the boundary was there. So for example, you have leftist parties, movements claiming to interpret the Courier Strike as demanding better work legislation in the sense of being treated as formal employees of platforms. And even though they meant to be part of the movement, right? And if you just cared for the banners and the words of political meaning, you could confuse them to be actors of the same space. There was a lot of tension between the Courier, who were actually demanding something more on the side of autonomy, even autonomy from formal employment, and these other parties. So if you look from the standpoint of the actual constraints and the actual form of the politics that was being done, the status of these leftist parties, trade unions, journalists, and so on was much more hybrid. Like either, it's not that it's totally outside, but at least the very fact that when you're amongst the couriers, everyone around you is part of it. But when you get to those parties, movements, some are inside and some are not, already allows you to qualify them as the interior and the boundary in this sense, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for example, like if you're a courier, you're already sort of like you're considered as you have like entrance into the movement. If you're a student and not a courier, then you have to sort of like demonstrate in practice that you're sort of like on their side. If you are maybe like a courier and an organized militant, then that sort of gets sort of like you're sort of like thrown from the moment you discover someone is like a member of a party, a courier, then he sort of becomes part of a boundary. Like people start to question of whether they are completely like part of the movement. So this is the useful identity here. So the closure of the movement, whatever is close to the movement, is the union of whatever is interior to it and whatever is in the boundary. And if we want to define directly the boundary, there are actually 3 different definitions of a boundary, and they're all, I think, useful to think. So we can define a boundary as whatever is common, which is, I think, related to what Yasha was saying, is the common region between the exterior, the closure of whatever is close to the exterior and whatever is close to the movement, whatever is common to that. So the intersection of these 2 regions is the boundary, right? So the boundary is a sort of membrane where these 2 spaces overlap. But you can also think of the boundary as whatever is not yet the interior of the movement. So as the closure minus the interior of the set. So it becomes a sort of frontier in the sense that it's not yet the interior. It's whatever is close enough to the movement, which could be become a part, but is not inside. Yeah. So you can also sort of like compute the boundary as the difference between the closure, whatever is close to the movement, and whatever is interior to the movement. And the third way to define the boundary is by the way of neighborhoods, which is asking which points, which sort of what regions in the space, when you look around, you can see both the interior, you can see both stuff that is inside the movement and stuff that is outside the movement. So the boundary is the space of sort of like, as I said, integration and dispute of the movement, because if you're in the boundary, whatever neighborhood you look around, you always are able to find a point which is outside and a point that's inside. So here's the sort of like intuition behind. So if you're here, no matter like how small the circle you draw around this point, you can find a point in the neighborhood which is outside and a point that is inside. That's what sort of like characterize a boundary. So that's basically what a boundary is in topological spaces. So I just wanted to give maybe some, I know it's not done, sorry. So one thing I found out that I think was cool is that Badiou introduces the body as a sort of like interior that you're able to form, right? From the points, I think, right? So if you're able to, he shows that the points satisfy these 4 axioms, and that they form an interior, and therefore they are able to form a topology. But which something I found that, and this definition, and normally like topologies are introduced in terms of open sets and closed sets. That's the sort of like common way to introduce a topology. But Badiou probably, I think, he introduced as using as a primitive an interior to sort of like maintain this notion of interiority, right, from Lazarus, I think. But as it turned out, like this axiomatization in terms of the closure, for example, is called the Kuratowski axioms, and you can quite sufficiently like introduce the boundary as a primitive to define a topology. So the way I sort of like want to interpret this is that it's not that boundary and interior are sort of like exclusive descriptions of a political movement. They are just like dual notions. It's just like two different perspectives. If you can look at the space from the point of view of what forms the boundary, but also from the point of view of its interior, right? It's just two different ways to sort of like analyze the situation. Sometimes it might be more useful to think in terms of one, or start from one and then go to the other, or start from the other and go to one of them. And yeah, so you can partition any space, say K, in terms of its interior, its boundary, and its exterior, which is this. And you can also like divide a movement so that whatever is close to the movement to its boundary and its interior. Yeah, so I thought of this like really simple example of to think like, for example, you have like what is the STP, like a speed, there are like people, meetings, there's some sort of interest in politics and math, and there are like jokes about TV series. But if you like think about how these things interact, you sort of see how like the sort of like place where people sort of like come and go and sort of like are interested in it are like by sharing, by committing to sort of interest in politics or math. And so you cannot like sort of, if you just interact with the TV series, you're not really able to interact with like a joke which is made inside the meeting without sort of like first minimally going through the sort of like interest in politics. And so right, and if you just try to like go to a meeting without either like just get a joke or a meeting, you're not like, it's not like a, doesn't make sense. So yeah, I don't know what it was just like an example that I don't know if I should have left this example here. Just like,
I think it just solved what an inside joke is formally.
An interior joke. Yes.
Yeah, and this is a solution that can only be understood in this space, which replicates formally what the inside joke is.
Yeah, it's an example of itself.
This is just perfect. You've just solved comedy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Rafael, for saving me from this. Yeah, so I was now this is more like just freestyling a bit with this notion. Just like thinking whether you can also think in other like fields. And I think you can, like, for me, the clearest one was like in a some sort of like amorous relationship. There's clearly like some elements which are sort of like internal to the couple, like the way you talk, the way like you interact and touch each other. And then there's always also a sort of like what defines the closure of a relationship is not this pure internal dimension, but there's always like this third element which sort of perturbs, right? Which is at the boundary of the interior of, a couple and the exterior world. So
yeah, I think it's the difference between intimacy and private affairs. Right? I mean, your work, your trips, your friends, they're private, meaning they concern you, but that's not the same as the interior of the couple, which is the intimacy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I was thinking like when, you know, like when the work of someone in the couple starts to sort of like make differences to the internal. So it's also, or like jealousy, right? The jealousy is, it postulates like a term which is sort of inside the couple, but it comes from the outside. But it is part of the dynamic and of the body, right, in a sense. So it's this element that appears from the outside, but it's not purely exterior. It's sort of like can compromise or sort of actually maintain some sort of. So you can. So one thing I was thinking about is like there's this figure of, you know, the couple that is enclosed into itself, right? It stops seeing friends, and so you could say that it's a couple that has no boundary, right? It's just the interior, but there's also like couples which struggle with they only function when they are like among friends, right? They miss the sort of like interior space of the relationship because they only like function when they're sort of like with elements from like in parties and this kind of stuff. So you can sort of like think about like spaces in which there's only like a boundary, like limit scenarios, right? In which these interior and boundaries sort of like change relevance. So yeah, and then I thought like you can think about like how this other space might be sort of like within the field or sort of like cross. So like, for example, with like works of art that sort of like have some dialogue with politics. So the problem of like interaction, right, between fields. You can think about distribute a bit the sort of entities that sort of like circulate in this common space as, for example, a manifesto, which has these two dimensions, but you have elements which are like form the sort of interior space. If you have only an art which is basically just like always in contact with politics, then you call that propaganda, right? Because it has no like intrinsic or interior value as art. Why you could sort of like try to strive for like a purely like sort of autonomous and interior art which has no relationship with the outside world, this sort of thing. And yeah, I'm not sure, in science I think it's more tricky, but like the problem of, you know, like when science starts and where it ends, it's called the demarcation problem, is also like a problem, right, which it occupies itself, being able to sort of like tell itself apart from philosophy, from non-science, from other theories, and this kind of stuff.
The parascience example is really good.
Yeah, right. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, it's really good. It really is like pure propaganda. Yeah, I really like this.
And yeah, so for the interior it's this. So the next part is about the reproduction. So I just put this here just because it vaguely sort of starts. It's something that I was discussing with Rafael the other day, because the next part is about reproduction, right? So we're talking about like whether we can talk about reproduction in general, not only like bounded by the mode C or like economy, and so yeah, so there are many questions there, but to me it's also like in the sort of domain of reproduction, you also will have like this boundary playing a role. So yeah, the next part will be sort of attempt to sort of use these interaction spaces to talk about like some sort of can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because my screen just, okay, sorry. Yeah, so use this sort of like interaction space more on the sense of an interaction which is more material, in the sense that there are stuff that is produced and stuff that is consumed. And so yeah, so I'll try to define these things. So it won't be
intuitively, just before you go into it, like the thing that I now realize is very useful that you ended up doing is that it's built into the formalism you created, the fact that because every outward arrow is potential, I mean, it's ultimately measured, right? Arrows between A and B are ultimately gonna be meaningful if they are, let's say, identical to the movement between A and itself. So ultimately, every outward production, like every interaction outward, is measured by how much it completes a reproductive cycle, right? So it ties the two things together like very, very deeply.
Yeah, so I'll try to explore this sort of like fourth interpretation of these arrows, right? So So you have farmers and vegetables, and they plant and it eats. Okay, so yeah, so I'll define production as these outward arrows, in which are actions from, say, A that reorganize materially the composition of B, right? So before we were thinking more in terms of like perception or sort of like interaction in which the material substrate can be left sort of like unchanged. So here, these production arrows, they will reorganize in some sense the composition of the object is interacting. Consumption will be the name of the effects from production, which can be incorporated materially into A, back into A. So say you are a human, you eat food, and then you produce food, and then you eat back food, right? And then you reproduce yourself. So reproduction is basically transformations that act on the internal composition of A via some, potentially via some production consumption arrow. And then like three more idea is, so you can have like arrows that never come back, which I'll call it waste. So are actions which destroy part of the internal composition of A. So you have food, not all, some of the food goes to waste. So you cannot all, like fully consume the food you produce, so it becomes garbage. So it never returns. So it's waste in the sense that it never returns. And then work would be the actions that they're not any sort of like, they're basically the actions which embed A into a larger space. So when you're able to sort of like produce and consume, and when you go back, you're not the same exactly. So it's not like pure reproduction. And you're able to sort of, the action that expand this space, but still preserves your identity in some way, is what I'm calling like work. So you go from A to like A line, which is a sort of the opposite of waste, right? It's sort of, and the sort of complement of work would be reduction, which are actions in which you're able to come back, but you lost, you come back, you go back to a sort of smaller. So for example, here you have, because you lost as waste something, there's a reduction from food to small food. Yeah.
Or for example, if you have very terrible eating habits and you lose capacities, that would be a reduction on the human side.
Yeah, yes. And then it's something that I had introduced before, this sort of like brackets is when you're able to sort of create this sort of like large equivalent space. I'm not sure like exactly what's the right way to call it, but the sort of like when you collapse these objects which are sort of like related in this way, in sort of either by work or by reduction, by like being able to grow or to reduce in a sort of like, you call it the same. So you just bracket and then collapse these two things. It's just like a notation.
Okay, maybe question / clarification. So work is basically where you do something and it, in a sense, give you something in return. That doesn't have to be like, it can be literally money, right? But it can also just be like, I don't know, you gained a skill, or you fixed something in your home, or you helped someone or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I'm a little confused about reduction, what you mean exactly here. I don't know if you like have
it would be
specific example.
I think is, so by the fact that you have waste, so you have a split, so you sort of decompose this object, food, into two things. Because it's returning in a reduced way. So it's the sort of like the part that remains, yeah, I think in the way, maybe the examples I'll try to give will sort of like clarify a bit, but it's basically the opposite of work in the sense that you return to a smaller space. So by the fact that something was wasted, you know that you lost something. right? So you got smaller instances.
The
So it
thing that
depends.
I think that makes it a bit
do we
more
have any-
confused. Sorry, yeah.
I was going to ask, because all these other examples, we can think of a way in which the individual subject kind of interacts, like an individual person fits in with each one of these, or how they transform a person, or how a person does something, right? For every one of these, I see for like other things, how you can like take something from something, but I don't know, with like,
Yeah, I mean,
exploitation, something like that, I don't know, or some kind of expropriation be a reduction of some sort. I don't know.
it can still, yeah, sorry.
Oh, please, Francis, sorry.
No, yeah, I was just saying that it can still be a part of reproduction, right? It's reproduction. It's just by the fact that not everything got incorporated in consumption. It's a reduced reproduction. That's what I will call like a reduced reproduction. I'm not sure if that.
Wait, the reduction is a reduced reproduction.
Yeah,
Yeah, my impression is that the problem is that the drawings on top, they have the operations inside of them. They're not always from the perspective of the source. So I think it's better to always have the human at the beginning. Then you can make the difference a bit clearer. Like if you eat food and it's crappy food and now you're sick, you're still yourself, but in some sense you're less than yourself, right? You could do things before you cannot do now. So you were reduced. So it's identity, but the very definition of identity got reduced. Like you're now identified to a subset of what you could do before, right? Versus what you called work, which I think it's quite ironic because it's work in this kind of classical sense of like work of art, not labor, right? Where you do something like you can consume or do whatever, but then you come back to yourself, but the definition of what you are is now expanded. So it includes new skills, something that wasn't part of what it means to be you before, right?
How you're saying something?
Yeah, I was going to say something that I think something that's causing, at least for me, confusion is the repetition of food, because it seems in a sense it's, I would make a difference between, just so I could speak in Portuguese because it's easier, and between alimento and comida. I don't know what or produce, or I don't know what would be the word, but because I think there's a human element of production. You produce something, but there's the waste that will exist. Like I don't know, you're planting tomatoes or bananas or whatever. You're not going to get them all. They're not going to be all things that you can consume. Some of them you're going to have to throw away. Some will be spoiled. I don't know if that difference is something that's relevant. Just because you use the human and the human with the apostrophe, and I think in that sense it makes sense. But in the food, I don't know. It confused me a bit.
I think it would maybe be more right to sort of just get this arrow back directly to human, and then qualify this consumption as a sort of like reduced consumption from the point of view of what it could be by the fact that something went to waste, right? So it's like a potential. It's because something got to waste, this consumption is reduced from the point of view of so the human could be more itself, were it able to waste less. So consumption is not like, it's a qualification of consumption. It's reduced. That's the best I think I can.
But wait, in the sense that, for example, it's reduced, like even if you eat something, what you're actually consuming is not the food, it's the vitamins or whatever is actually integrated into your system. And I don't know, what you poop or whatever, that would be waste in a sense, because it doesn't. I'm sorry if I'm confused.
I think the reduction gets qualified by the fact that there is this division between arrows, right? Because it can be always the same food, but the fact that you are able to test this division, this decomposition of basically just the fact that these two arrows separated, and you got back only one of them.
Okay.
It's reduced from that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So if you didn't know there was garbage, like it would.
Enzo, but don't you think this, when you put garbage away from this scheme, you bring some environmental issues back to this problem, don't you think? Because there is no garbage that goes away. It never goes away. This is all the climate problem today, don't you think? When you look to reproduction from that point of view, I think we are playing the economic game, just playing economic game, this regular, the business as usual, let's say like that.
I'm curious to see what you're going to think about the next part, because so I think the way I'd say that is that it's waste is not like in an ontological way. It's just the fact. So when you unfold this interaction space, the arrows that you cannot account back to your reproduction, whatever the point of view is. So you fix a point of view of the human. The arrows you cannot account, that you cannot account them from the point of view of reproduction, they are waste by definition. So it's like a perspective of waste. So I'll
I agree with you.
Maybe it'll get clear. I
agree, but I think this is the problem because we think about that like something that goes away. We keep reproducing a bad system.
But if the world,
you know what I mean?
I think I'm not like, if you took the world, like the planet as the term, there would be no waste from the point of view of this production and consumption of. There would be no waste.
Heat waste.
Except. So let's see.
No, but I think probably we should just, I think that the issue is that there is a trivial notion of waste, which is, ultimately no interactions fully interact with every part of the other term. So by definition, like it's not, unless it's part of itself, right? You always interact with a part and there is something which is not included. So there is like a very trivial notion of close to like entropic kind of things that are not connected, things are disorganized or whatever. And perhaps it's too trivial. And there's too specific notion of garbage, which I don't think is what you want to do because you're trying to give a formal, broader definition. So in between the two, I think that there is this formal definition of arrows that are meaningful. So they vary together with the meaningful term. So the more food you eat, the more garbage you produce. Like those two things vary together. So they are connected. But it's not part of the reproduction, right? So it's connected, but disconnected in another sense. Like if I create this boundary, it still varies with the things inside of it. So let's say, if I'm looking at the occupation, literal disposal of bodily fluids by students varies with the amount of students, but it's not part necessarily, it might not be part of the interior of the movement. For example, they might not account for their own waste disposal system. They still rely on the garbage system of the city. So it's internal because it varies with the internal elements, but it's not totally internal because it's not connected back to it, right? It falls under one of those three categories you created last time for things that are at the verge of not being connected, right? So that's not trivial because not everything like heat from the body of the students is not that relevant, right? So you wouldn't need to draw it, but there are relevant things which nevertheless are not connected, right? In the reproduction system. So those would be perhaps what fits into that category, right? Just so it's not trivial, like not everything that is not accounted for and not too specific where it's only debris that could never be reintegrated, right? It could be, let's say there's an occupation where they account for their own disposal system and create connections with the strike of the garbage workers, suddenly the garbage became part of the reproduction. So I think to avoid like these ontological claims, oh, there's always, you know, entropy. Okay, fine, but it's not always politically relevant, right? That's too trivial. And also not to create like too absolute a term like the actual waste in the planet. It becomes a relative one if you give it this, as exactly as you did, like it's at the boundary of the reproduction structure, right? It varies with it in a meaningful way. The more food you eat, the more garbage you produce. It could still be connected under certain restrictions, like somebody who recycles a lot or who cooks better will produce less garbage. So you could connect it back, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll try to apply this, and I'm curious to see if it will make any sense. Okay, so before that, it's you have like how Karatani right discusses these two forms of how does he call it, antediluvian, yeah, right, yeah, this
pre-industrial, yeah,
which is yeah, I don't want to go too much here, but it was just like try to represent them. So you have, if you remember, like at the end I tried to sort of like describe these interaction spaces in terms of the modes. So you could have like, so he says that merchant capital is basically is obtained by extracting differences between systems of value, right? So we have equivalent spaces in which commodities exchange, and the element which is able to sort of like transit between these spaces, so the merchant, because there is no direct if these two system of values were connected, right, you wouldn't be able to have merchant capital. It's by the fact that there's no commodity exchange, direct commodity exchange between the markets, is that the figure of a merchant can appear, someone who can transit in this border from different systems of value. So he's able to extract a difference and sort of reproduce itself because there's no direct interaction here. So he can sort of like do a equivalent exchange, like a fair exchange here and a fair exchange here. But because these two markets all interact via the merchant, from their point of view, it's still like a fair thing to do, right? They cannot feel the other market to feel it was like to sort of like now, how do you say, like not neutralize, but there's this, no, yeah, I forgot the word, but like make them, if they were to come into contact, they would sort of rearrange. But the merchant sort of extract this in its reproduction. It's able, because it's able to interact with both systems, it's able to, so it's waste. So here, for example, I would say it's waste from the point of view of market. It's just in the sense that it's something that gets lost in the interaction. And then there's analogous form of this capital, but it happens in time. So you have a market and a future market. The user is able to sort of like make these relations with the future and sort of extract the difference from there, right? Okay, so, and then it's a sort of an attempt to model industrial capital, which yeah, no idea if it will, but I try to represent I think Reza wanted to say something.
No, I mean, it was related to the previous diagram, related to the concept of waste. I think part of the confusion, or at least the confusion I had, was the reduction, which is an activity between food and food prime, or food prime and food. And so when you talk about activities that happen between food and human, like object A and object B, then it's understandable, because production and consumption are trivial, intuitive terms. But the interaction or the movement from food to food prime was not totally intuitive. Like, what is that interaction? Like, how, under what conditions food goes to food prime, right?
Yeah.
So at the danger of making this too subjective, that you need like agency or something like this, you need to be able to define what exactly that interaction is.
Yeah, I think it was a bad idea to have that food prime. Like, it's, so here it will appear again, is basically when you have a division of arrows in which one of the arrows go back to the, is a reproduction, becomes a reproduction path, and the other does not. So it's just this. So yeah, let's see if it makes any sense. But here you have the description of the simple reproduction of capital. So you start, so capital starts with some like money, right? It organizes the labor process in such a way that there is these two commodities, like, right, means of production and labor power. Then there's like, so it produces in this sense, it reorganizes the composition of the world in such a way that this thing have, and it consumes in the sense that it's able to sort of like go back to itself as more money. So it consumes this means of production, and which is the way I think Marx talked about it, right? Capital sort of consume labor power and means of production in order to have more capital. And in the case of simple reproduction, all this sort of like surplus is spent in sort of like the consumption of the capitalists. So from the point of view of capital, it's waste, right? So the point of view of this reproduction arrow is a reduced reproduction, because everything goes to, whatever is extra goes to the capitalist. And this passage, which from what I understand, like Marx calls productive consumption, which is this sort of like, it's sort of in between, right? Of it's productive and is also consumption, because I think it's interacting with this other substrate, right? So it's in the boundary of something. But from the point of view of this capital, is just, it's not accounted for directly. So that's why, from the point of view of reproduction errors, it only means this sort of like outgoing, and you can sort of like just partition between the sort of substrate that you interact and reorganize, and whatever you're able to incorporate as consumption. So, so the extended reproduction of capital, so it's reproduction, right? The extended reproduction is when this capital, which starts as a sort of accumulation fund, you're able to go to the production process. So you're able to organize. So it depends on being able to produce, to reorganize the world in such a way that there is this thing called wage labor and means of production, right? So the dispossession of the means of production and the formation of is literally like the production of that. And then when it's able to sort of like complete this reproduction, consume all this labor and means of production, it's for some like sort of like mystified reason, it increases. It is able to incorporate itself into something bigger, which is accumulation, more capital, right? So, so yeah, in my attempt, this sort of auto-valorization would be when you sort of collapse these two spaces in a self-valorization reproduction arrow. So we know that this is not the full story, right? That's why I put the sort of dotted line, because but from the point of view of this interaction, that's how it gets completed, I think. And so that now I'll try to sort of like tell this story from the point of view of the worker. I haven't been looking at the chat. So.
Can I just complement something there? Because I think that the distinction between simple reproduction and extended reproduction I'm not sure if that's what you said, but just to make sure I understood it correctly, how to go through here, because simple reproduction is when this produces more, but everything that was more than M itself, the capitalist takes for himself, and then he puts back exactly the previous amount, right? So you did make more, so you put 100 here, this is worth 120, but then you consume privately 20 and put back 100, right? So you always reproduce the same size of production. And the extended reproduction is when, let's say you had 100, you made 120, you only take 10 for yourself, and the next cycle is now 110. So there is surplus in both. It's just the division between these two things that changes. In the first case, every surplus goes to private consumption. And in the second case, only a part of it goes to private consumption and some is brought back. So as you said,
except the arrows in the extended is from M to M prime, right?
Yeah, so the arrows invert, I think, I'm not sure, yeah, so if you notice, this is a reproduction arrow, but it's a qualified consumption because we know there's some waste. Like it's just imposing the form that there is, you go back to itself, right? While, and so, yeah, I'm not sure if it's the right way to do it, but like what here is not yet a reproduction arrow, right? You have work in the sense that, in the sense that you're only able to, I don't know if the arrows should go the other way, but the fact is that you need that operation that I had shown before, right? So this, yeah, it makes sense because this is not a reproduction cycle, you see, right? The arrow doesn't go back. So it only becomes a reproduction once you collapse these two objects. So I think that's maybe the important point. So
yeah, but my impression is that you're mixing like the logic and the temporal aspect, because
I think the second one is like the diagram for surplus value, right?
Yeah, but both
So
of
M
them are
becomes M
surplus.
prime.
Yeah, but both of them should, right? I mean, I think the first case is just that you have M1, you buy stuff here, you produce a product, you have M2. Then, so this M1 became M2. Now you're going to take something out and you're going to go back to M1 and start it all over again. That's this thing here. The second one is when you have M1, you buy stuff, produce, you have M2. Now you take something out, but this doesn't mean you go back to M1. You go to what we call M3, because it's neither M1, the initial capital, not the total surplus. It's less than the total surplus, but still more than M1. This is crucial because, well, with M3, now you need to buy more X than you previously had, right? To reproduce more money, you need more commodities to produce more product. And this fact here will require us to zoom out and realize that for a single capitalist to expand their production, every other capital needs to be expanding as well, because there needs to be more commodities to buy. Otherwise, you cannot buy them and and use them in a productive way to produce more surplus, right? And furthermore, like I agreed, I like calling this waste in a certain sense, but it goes back to the point that waste is relational and you can always kind of zoom out to reconnect it, because this private consumption, how is it going to be consumed? Through commodities, right? And these commodities also come from the same system. So if the same movement that Marx makes when he gets to this formula, this is, let's say, the trampoline for the zooming out of a single capital to a system of capitals. Because this formula only makes sense if there's more people producing, so you can actually buy more stuff to produce more stuff and get more surplus. And because you want to account for where are private consumption of capitalists going. So that's, let's say, the door from book 1 to book 2. This is a department where capitalists buy luxury items. And that's a department of production, large scale talking. And this here takes you to capital competition and the difference between capitals that produce means of production. And you need to start accounting for the size of the labor market and things like that. So I think it's nice that every time you write waste, it's almost like an indication that there is a possible perspective shift to a different scale, where perhaps the boundary now falls with the waste inside of it, no longer at the frontier, right? So I'm not sure you need to change the arrows here to make that point. But I don't know, I think that that's perhaps relevant. I don't know, man, like I feel like there's probably a more elegant way to write this thing you want to capture, which I kind of get, but as you said, like in a certain sense, you want to talk about the fact that this human here now it's different but the same, right? For example, if there was a break here, if you didn't recognize this as yourself, you wouldn't be what you mean as well, right? So somehow this needs to be a cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's something there that I think it's still like, it's just in the way that it's written that might be possible to make more compatible, both with what we had on those logical formulas for capital and with this idea of somehow it's not just because this is what the capital transformation did, right? Like when we write down this with some delta going out and with the commodities and product, right? We wrote this as K, which sees both things. This is like capital reproducing. And when we wrote it as this extended thing, well, this now is M3 and X prime and P prime and so on with M4 here. We wrote this whole thing as K, a series of Ks, right? This is exactly as you have there. Because you still are yourself, even though you're changing the nature of your operation, right? Because these scalings sometimes are qualitative. You change factories, change every worker, change method of production, but still the same capital, right? So there's something about this idea of this qualitatively different, but still reproductive process, right? That perhaps there's a way of writing that doesn't imply that now you need to change the side of the arrow or separate the terms in a way that one of them is self-relating, the other is not. There might be something, I don't know.
Yeah. But
it's superficial, I think.
Mm-hmm. Because the thing is that if you can't just say that, oh, there's a reproduction and you come back to a larger space. There's this sort of like logical signal that it's not enough. You cannot qualify the reproduction as sort of like extended. Is the fact that you need this extra operation, which sort of like collapses objects. So there is this sort of historical like dimension in the sense that you have to sort of like say that there is this in order to, so if you started from here, you cannot say you don't remember like that there is this sort of like growing things. It's just from the point of view of unfolding this process, right? So you get, if you were to grow here and then you're sort of like retrospectively collapse this into the same, just because these future things can relate themselves in a sort of like homogeneous way, that you can sort of remember that. Yeah.
I mean, a hint that I think we could follow to see the thing that needs to be self-reproducing, right, is that simple reproduction reproduces an amount of money, the amount of capital that is going to be invested. Expanded reproduction reproduces a rate of growth. So the actual thing that goes to itself is the rate, not the amount, right?
Makes sense to mark it, right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. The last one makes more sense to me. Like if you go back to the rate to 0, then you go to the previous one, where everything that is above that is waste. So there is something in that direction that might.
I just wanted to say something because I was thinking. Sorry to interrupt, because this is what I was trying to work out in my head. when I said if there was a way to represent this endless expansion, and when you did the diagram about the work, the W asterisk, I was thinking that in a sense it seems as if I was thinking this in for example self-help terms, because this is how my mind works. But I was thinking that a human being, it reproduces itself if it eats food, if it, I don't know, has a house or whatever. But there's some specific type of work that will produce a sort of surplus that will make him not the same person, that it will be more than he is, in a sense that he is a better version of himself. So there's a special kind of work, or maybe it could be food. I don't know, if you eat better food, you're a better person. I don't know. But I was thinking there was this kind of logic where and I think what Gabriel said, it cleared things up. There's a rate of growth that is what is reproduced. And I was wondering if we could recast the reproduction in terms of a zero rate of growth, so it could make the diagram more visible. Instead of putting the reproduction as, instead of putting the expansion of capital as something that you'll add a rate of growth, you could put the reproduction as a 0% rate of growth. I don't know if that could make it more streamlined.
You know where I think this makes a lot of sense, just to connect it to the previous stuff we were doing. Remember, Renzo, when we came up with that idea of, we have like the individual, the social space, the organization, and the body. And we said, well, the individual interacts with the organization in a way that's different than how he interacts with the social space. Why? Because the organization constrains the body constrains the organization in a different way. And the idea, remember, was to expand this here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Right. So this here, I think, is what you're calling this expanded thing, right? I mean, just to give a concrete example, right? For example, a militant, like a student that becomes a militant in an occupation is no longer a student in the same sense. He's not reproducing himself as a student in the same way as if he was just going to school. So there is some kind of displacement or expansion, right? You're still a student. You need to know that experience, otherwise it's contained, like it becomes a region of what being a militant student is, right? You still fighting about the school experience, so you're still, that experience is part of you, but now you're expanded, right?
Yeah, and I think if you take some principles out of what we've been talking and discussing, the point of view that allows simple reproduction to appear something would have to be the point of view of the extended reproduction of capital. And so I don't know if this is confusing, but maybe what we can only see simple reproduction if we have the extended reproduction of capital in mind. So I think there's an inverse order, at least in how you present the logic. I think the order of presentation is you go from the simple to the extended, but I think the logic has to already account for the extended reproduction of capital, or else you're only going to be adding, I don't know, puxadinhos. So I think it would make it more elegant if like in the same sense that, well, what makes the militant point of view visible and lets us see that a student is not only a student, is that there's the political body or the org or whatever. So if you think that a reproduction is a case where there's no expansion or extension of the reproduction, I think it can be a bit more simple, in the sense that you're using the logic of the expanded to treat a simpler case, because I think the simpler case is not the extended case is not an extension of the simpler case, but the simpler case is a subset of the extended reproduction. And I think that's Marx's point of view when he's going on about the order of presentation and the order of the logic. But because I was thinking it like, oh, so do you add infinite, something to symbolize infinite arrows of reproduction? But that would just be inverting the order. I think maybe there's some, I think we have to treat the reproduction as I don't know if this is too much, but I think maybe social reproduction has to be treated as a zero change, zero rate of growth of whatever is being reproduced.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense to me. Like,
because it's a sort of retrospective effect, right? You have exactly, because you have this infinite movement is only from the point of view of infinity, you're able to sort of locate the reproduction, right? But you do that only after that happens. So there's this, there's some surprise always, right? Whenever you expand to this like larger levels, it's once you're done, you're able to go back and sort of collapse. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure.
No, I think that it's just a matter of a formal principle which says that, I mean, if you take it too far, I don't like it, but in a certain kind of general sense, it's something like, for example, you added the word art there, but art is just a form of production with extra constraints, right? So it's deceiving to write it as a type of object that you can just go through it and you become something else. It's because it's an object that is connected to other constraints. And because you're now connected to those other constraints, that it takes you somewhere else. And so even though it might be interesting in a concrete situation to block out a bunch of stuff, right? To cut at a joint at a smaller level, just like consider the person, the food, and eating, right? It's good to have a marker that's always, let's say, a restriction of something which would be better accessible or more intelligible if you broaden it. So, for example, consuming art, like consuming a movie just as a form of entertainment to rest, pretty much taking you to yourself. So if no other constraints are relevant when you're watching a movie, so for example, the relation of a movie to a movie genre or movie style, those are not relevant to analyze the system, and you're only left with the person and the object, then that's consumption, right? If you need to account for it in the bigger system, then that's artistic consumption, because you need to account for those things. Like, they are relevant for what you're doing, right? For example, if there are no other movies of that type, that's the only movie of that type, that's an experience. Like, it's a meaningful distinction for the consumption of art. So I think that that's relevant because there are two things that seem to always point outward, that probably the boundary is further down. One is waste, right? And the other is subjectivity. There are the two things that are disturbing, like simple reproduction in your scheme, right? When there's something you call waste, it actually means that it's probably integrated. You will see it as integrated if you zoom out. And if there's something that transformed the person, the individual, like in a way that's not direct, I remain myself after this, right? Like, I'm a labor power, I consumed food, now I'm the same labor power ready to work the next day. But I consumed something in a meaningful way. So I changed because I consumed it. Well, if you want to talk about that change, you probably need to zoom out as well.
Yeah, but I think I call it discipline because it has this subjective dimension of only after it happened, only from the point of view of here, that you're able to sort of like call it reproduction, only because you're already able to sort of like, because this is not from the point of view of this moment, is not reproduction. So only after you're able to sort of like collapse these two subjectively, in this sense, you're able to look back and sort of like treat it as a consumption. So I think there's this subjective operation of collapsing these two things and looking back and saying, okay, it's now I'm bigger because this happened, something like so it has, I think it's consistent, right? No, just
I was just going to ask if the discipline isn't on the M line part, because you don't have to be disciplined when you're producing. You have to be disciplined when you're consuming. You have to be disciplined when you're writing. You have to be disciplined when you're analyzing. You have to be disciplined when you're analyzing. You have to be disciplined when you're producing. You have to be disciplined when you're consuming. You have to be disciplined when you're producing. after you've gotten your money, and you're not going to waste it on luxury goods or whatever. So I don't think the arrow of reproduction would be on that point, even if we were considering, I mean, if we are differentiating the extended and the simple reproduction from the point of view of, well, in one of them, you have more, you don't waste part of the money, or you waste less in the reproduction of the individual consumption of the capitalist. Like as Gabriel said, instead of getting all the 20 that you're extra and buying large houses, you're going to only buy a small house and then reinvest 10 in the production. I don't think the discipline is in the lower part of the diagram. I think it has to be in the upper part, because you are disciplined after you have more money, not before. Because before, you are doing what other capitalists do, which is just invest some quantity in the production of commodities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not really following that part of the subjective thing. I think just a formal suggestion is perhaps we should just define, because you had clear rules for this case, right? Where you have, sorry, for this, you have, let's say, A, B, and C. You had something like this, A, B, C, right? So we know that going this way is the same as going this way. Those rules were clear, but I think that you don't need to, I think perhaps a slightly more technical definition of what this means would already account for the fact that it's the same as saying this. Like ID A, B, C, right? Which means going this way is the same as going this. In some sense, you're already saying that it's the same as also going from A to A prime to A double prime and so on. You know, like there is probably already a technical addition to what this means.
Because I think the point, like formally, it's qualitatively a different kind of diagram, right? It's a weird diagram which doesn't fit on reproduction, and it's not also a waste diagram. So it's qualitatively different. So it already signals that if you're able to, when you define, I don't know if it's a good argument actually, but it's qualitative. So I think you're allowed to call it something different precisely because it's not a simple reproduction. It has this different sort of like geometry.
Yeah, but you see, this is the point. Like, look at this thing here. It's exactly the same as that idea that individual, like we call this a discipline when taking this path is different from taking this, which is what's happening here. Like you are different from yourself going through art, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like exactly the same sort of thing we called discipline before. I think that it's just a matter of having rules for example, R, W prime composing with R. Like this, in a certain sense, needs to be the same as R. Because then you can still call this R, right? So, you know, like there's the internal rules for the self arrows. Why are these not? And I feel like, for example, if we were to the more categorical side, I wouldn't know what to suggest because there needs to be something that sees this interaction here that is different from this. And probably the way we were doing this is including something here and so on, right? But that's my impression, like that you would need something like this. And this is meaningful, you know, to this here. Like the fact that this is an object that interacts with other objects and so on. This is meaningful for why this is different from this. But I'm not sure yet. I'm just thinking that probably that's the path that would make these things more elegantly connected. But I don't want to kind of delay you too much with this. The general point is clear for me.
Can I just do one last delay? I'm sorry, Renzo. but I think this is really good because, and I even put it on the chat, but it seems that the difference between reproduction and expansion is when the formula of reproduction is always R plus W prime, but there are many instances where the W prime is 0. So if there is no, if the value of W prime is 0, it's only a simple reproduction. It's a case, or is that too easy? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's like once you're able to define this sort of like larger space, simple reproduction becomes a particular case, but only afterwards, right?
Yeah. I just thought it because in a sense it makes the at least the main point of view a dynamic point of view where you are always considering it from the point that a certain subject, but I'm talking subject here in a like only in the certain point in the diagram, you're always talking about not only its relation to itself but how it changes itself. But I'm sorry, it's as Reza said, it's very exciting, so I get carried away.
Yeah, also just also as a side remark for later, I think we'll probably see that there is a connection between this expanded reproduction and waste, in the sense that, for example, just to give the art example, if you consume a really amazing piece of work, just as simple consumption for the sake of your reproduction, there is something about the work of art that goes to waste, like a network of relations that goes to waste. If it doesn't go to waste in the sense that it's meaningful for that interaction, then something happens on the side of the reproduction of the individual. And it's even valid for the ecological point of view, right? If you consume food and a lot of it goes to waste, the tendency is that it's a very simple consumption where you don't care for these other aspects of it. The more the waste of the food is actually reconnected back to the cooking process, so you know how to cook it so that little goes to waste, a skill needs to be added, right? So, I mean, that relation between, you know, kind of entropy versus organizing, I mean, it's very basic, but it might actually be capturable, you know, in this thing. Anyway, just for future. So, yeah, so now the attempt is to tell this story from the point of view of the worker. So, because I also have the impression that Marx sort of like when he talks about capital, there are certain things he calls consumption, right? Consumption of the labor, consumption of means of production from the point of view of but he also talks about production and consumption from the point of view of the worker. There's this sort of duality. So we should be able to tell some story from the point of view of the worker. So he actually like mentions how variable capital is just a particular form of the appearance of this more general thing, which is the labor fund, for providing the necessaries of life, for the maintenance of himself and family, and which whatever be the system of social production, he must himself produce and reproduce, right? So you have this general reproduction of the worker, in which he produces stuff which he is able to consume in order to reproduce. But we know that in like capitalist reproduction, there's something that goes to waste. Like he's a worker, he gets composed. So this is also a new type of arrow of diagram in which you have the composition of spaces. So when two arrows go together, so it's the opposite of waste, right? So you have like a composition of a sum of spaces. So do you have this sort of like which pre-capitalistic like form would be sort of like the some sort of a collective work or something. But yeah, in any case, you have when this element which is external gets added, he's able to produce a product, and what he gets back for consumption is not the product, is the wage, right? So something goes away, and from the point of view of a reproduction, it feels like the wage is sort of the translation, the sort of material translation of this product, right? So it can be called a reproduction once you define that this product becomes a wage and the wage is consumed.
So there's this, so I put a dotted because it is this sort of like mystified reproduction, which I think there's also a place from the point of view of capital. But that's not the full story, because there's another important reproduction arrow, which is like the family, right? So you also have like self reproductions that are not part of the scheme of this reduced reproduction, which is the sort of like domestic economy of the worker, which includes the feminine labor and sort of like lands, and there's all this. So the debate with Chico de Oliveira, in which you are able to sort of like lower, say, the value of this wage, because it's interacting. It has a reproduction cycle which is outside of this wage work, right? So I already like calling this the sort of interior of the worker and the sort of like border of the worker, because it's a border because it's in contact with the sort of other space, right? The same way that here there was this sort of like magical leap in which is I think the thing in which like the labor, the commodity of labor power becomes a power to produce, right? So it becomes source of value. So there's this sort of like, it sort of like goes outside of the space of, as this weird short circuit in which the same thing participates into circuits in some way, right? So if we try to put these two like diagrams together, sort of like connect the arrows, maybe you're able to define like these two spaces, like a space of, that describes the full reproduction, right? So you have the worker, and then these two sort of like mystified arrows sort of like get more elucidated. It's productive consumption because it's production for what is production for one is consumption for the other, and what is consumption for the other becomes production. So we can, I think, locate a bit this dimension of reorganization of production, which is done by, it's the only production done by capital, right? Which is the way capital can transform this space and make it more like optimal to guarantee reproduction, and absolute surplus value appears when you become more like effective in converting this into products, right? And so that's why I think there's this quote. So the labor consumes in a twofold way. While producing, he consumes by his labor the means of production, and converts them into products with a higher value than. This is his productive consumption, and then he also has his individual consumption, right? So there's this duality, which I used to sort of like. So if you notice, there are two productions. So there's this duality, right? So what is production for one becomes consumption for the other. So that's what I call dual production. But there's also a double reproduction. There's this cycle, right? Which is in the border of, which is mediated by wage. And there's this sort of like external or internal reproduction, which is outside of the circuit, right? So it's a double reproduction in this sense. So, so if you like try to come, so the sort of like leap of faith is, it's describing this dual production in terms of like the body and the world, and this double reproduction in terms of the interior and the border, which I don't know if, but and so so in the broader context of like a general body and a general social world, if we want to like maintain this descriptions, I think you could. So this was like an argument to sort of like try to think in terms of reproduction and production in terms of generic bodies of struggle, right, against our world. So this sort of external duality of production in which capital tries to reorganize and consume and reincorporate political bodies is what this sort of counter reproduction is, which are these identities which are mediated of capital, which are mediated by the body. We could probably like capitalist reproduction. Both the arrows that are not necessarily interacting with the body, but also those that are, and some sort of like communist reproduction when you have the opposite face. So this is the dual production. You have like this struggle, one trying to sort of like incorporate the other into itself and expand, etc. But if we like divide this body into its interior and its boundary, the boundary becomes the sort of outer going arrows, which is this the way that like communization theory defines communism, right? This movement of that immediately produces a new world. It's like you're able to destroy the social world and immediately produce communism. So you're able to reincorporate into this political body like in this sort of like direct way, which is clearly like, I think, like it's an action over the world, right? Over the capitalist order. There's no like, while like common, like theory of commons, and there is more about like these internal resources, which are sort of like not completely like expropriated by the world. They are able to sort of like reproduce itself in sort of like more untouched space and produce commons, which are like the seeds of communism. But if we take like these two perspectives together and identify it with the interior and the boundary, then you're able to more or less see that these are just like two ways of describing a single thing, just the body. And yeah, so it's an internal difference. So that's why I call it decision, because it's sort of reminds, I think I was discussing with Gabriel, sort of reminds a bit of theory of subject. But I don't know if it's just something that is there. But so yeah, so this together, it's just like a proposal to sort of like describe all those arrows and identities, like putting everything together, so the boundaries and everything that came before with this sort of like description in the particular form of capitalist reproduction, and sort of like thinking more like general terms. That would be the sort of idea. And yeah, so this is, I don't know what, but and then I try to sort of map these movements in sort of like pre-existing forms in the communist movement. I don't know if it's convincing, but basically, like the forms of internal forms of reproduction, like the work fund, the cooperatives, the commune, all of these elements in which we tend to describe as a sort of like prefigurative or sort of like internal part, essential part of another world, while you have all the sort of like actions that act on the world in a way that you try to destroy it. And when you're able to reincorporate, so it's destruction when you don't have consumption. That would be the definition of destruction, right? And when you're able to reincorporate into yourself, then you have the sort of like productive consumption, which is this other form of reproduction, right? Which is like basically claiming more regions of the world into yourself. So again, I think a nice way to see this double reproduction and this sort of like dual production of this.
Why not call the thing that you call the little question mark in the consumption? Isn't it something like democratic deliberation?
Yeah.
Something between the combination of state and community.
Yeah, but so I put it, yeah, autonomous justice, like something, yeah, with the, but I couldn't think of a way of sort of like, sort of like, what it would, it's like taking, you know, like this way of reclaiming, sort of like reappropriating. Yeah, you would say.
Yeah, I think it's something on the line of, you know, participatory democracy.
Yeah, that's true. Like democratic control of.
Yeah, democratic control. It's not the inner management. So it's not, let's say, a socialist management of funds or something like this, because that's more internal to the state. It's more about how you collectively manage funds, right? So it's between A and C, as you said. It's more about establishing contracts through the people, right?
Yeah.
Rather than deciding funds through the people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's about democracy.
Something like that.
This is the end of the third part.
I have one question about this whole this one here. Why are you putting revolt on the side of production and revolution on the side of consumption specifically?
I don't know.
Was that just kind of arbitrary? I was just curious.
Yeah, for me, the intuitive part of it is that revolt tends to be, on its own, it tends to be destructive without guaranteeing that it's absorbing back, right? Yeah. So it's like outward, interruptive, destructive, so on. Well, revolution implies in some sense that you're going to manage the thing in the place of what you destroyed, right? So it has this more constructive kind of use-like aspect to it, right? So you should take power, you should not only interrupt the other, but actually actively do something, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because Dove, which is like one of the communization theories, he says that revolution is equal to like insurrection plus revolution, I think. So he says that revolution is equal to insurrection plus communization. So it would be a bit the same, like revolt would be the sort of destructive part, and communization is this movement which is able to sort of like incorporate the effects of this insurrection, of this revolt, and then you would get a revolution.
Yeah, I tend to like just because of Lenin and shit, like to put revolution on a more neutral place, like what war is for mode A, I would probably put revolution for mode B. This in a way that we can actually use, let's say, the word to talk about right-wing revolutions, like this sort of wage on the inconsistent aspect of state logic, but it's still pretty much state logic, just in the sense that war is still just reciprocity, but like its destructive side, right? And then perhaps find a word. I'm thinking here that confiscation, expropriation, taking power, liberation, management, they all seem to go towards what, when Marx describes the idea of communism has to do with the administration of things. Is this kind of ordinary government of the world, right? It's just because revolution, it has this kind of, it still has a bit of the feeling of an interruption, and it's usually relevant to the state. Like it's hard to think about revolutions that have nothing to do with the state in any sense,
Yeah, it's true.
So perhaps there is a word that is more specific to what you're talking, that would make clearer the relation between consumption and these terms, because they all transform, they all make the world into something that through its transformation, something is reproduced in the movement, right? In this new state of affairs, right? Mm-hmm. By confiscating, expropriating, taking power, liberating, managing funds, and so on, you're actually, let's say, you're no longer consuming militants in order to reproduce communism. You're consuming the world to reproduce communism, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's a distinction between the reproduction elements you have and the consumption ones. Like the consumption ones, you're actually expanding the outer world. That's why it's at the border, right? At the boundary. You're using up other systems to reproduce this communist structure.
Mhm.
So it is consumption proper, like in the sense of going through the other and coming back to yourself, and you reproduce yourself in that way. Whereas reproduction in your schema, the other is still part of the interior, right?
I mean, I'm calling, because there are two reproductions, right? Again, there's this internal reproduction, which I'm just simply calling reproduction, and this movement that goes outside and comes back, which is also reproduction, but
but it's like consumption here is like expanded communist reproduction, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that's why I see why I call it revolution, and I probably like that, but perhaps I wouldn't want transition, because I think it's also like a provisory term. But I also feel like revolution is just, it's just nomenclature, right? But there might be a term for it, which is a bit more kind of, what does it mean when, how do we, perhaps it's revolution, I don't know. I'm just trying to think if there isn't a name for this expanded process of engulfing other things into the communist movement, which
another name is communization, right?
Yeah, communization, perhaps. Yeah, but anyway, I think that's secondary. Like it makes a lot of sense to me. And the thing that, just to make sure I got some key points from the presentation, because it's really a lot. I feel like you really touched on like stuff we never really managed to kind of move ahead, and suddenly there's a lot of new kind of material to deal with. To me, the two big kind of innovations you proposed, I'm not sure if you agree, those are the two main ones, but the first is this thing, which I honestly, since it's all about expanding the ID arrow, right? Like everything starts with that. And it's like a weird mix of causal analysis with graph theories. Like I think it's a thing on its own. I'm not sure if there's an exact counterpart anywhere, but I would call it reproduction theory, because I think the ID arrow, especially after we discussed that in some sense, expanded reproduction and direct identity, they should fall on the same side somehow, right? Mm-hmm. Calling those arrows reproduction, like in the sense that we're taking the standpoint that a father reproduces himself insofar as he has a relationship with the son. If he has no relationship with the son, he never had a son. It's not even a negative relation. He's not a father, right? I know in category theory, this is how you define identity, by all the things that something has relations to. Like the thing is those set of relations. But I feel like in some sense, everything you constructed is based on the very basic grammar of the formalism, always making that equivalent, or making that equality between being what you are and going through some paths, right? That's the kind of fundamental premise of the grammar. It's still tricky for me to understand when the path is through yourself and it's not trivial, right? So this kind of expanded capital, or the kind of expanded capacity or reduced capacity of some term. Like if you want to track that, it looks like you need to have a way of talking about these arrows of A to itself and distinguishing between them. They're not the same, or they're the same in some specific way. So there's some tricky part there, but it seems like that fundamental equation of something going to itself is the same as it going through that thing, right? That seems to me like the first big kind of innovation, because we were having that trouble, right? We were having an easier time talking about the sort of internal construction. So so organs, they are connected to the body. So there is some internal structure, and that seemed to be the end all of political construction, this inward construction. But with this very basic kind of way of approaching everything, suddenly it's you can now equate how much you belong to the body with what paths through the world you take. So now there is like a very basic way of approaching outward interaction that is constantly keeping track and redefining what it means to belong to the body. So I think that this translates into the second point, which I found also totally lacking. We haven't, neither we did it, nor Badiou did it anywhere. So it's like, for me, it's an original contribution in the same kind of building, which is exploring the distinction between interior and boundary and showing that you can actually split a lot of concepts by using that distinction, right? So suddenly we have like this whole discourse for reproduction. We can use the theory of this boundary to talk about production and so on. So it really reaches something which was very kind of minimal until now, you know? And then I have the impression that most, yeah, so Yashin even gives this homotopy theory feel to it. You know, it's pretty much a theory of equivalences, right? Of what counts as, what weird paths count as the same thing, right?
Maybe equivalent is the name because it's this sort of identity that measures itself by this, what you can call, right?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I never stopped to think about it. Homotopy pretty much means that, right? What places count as the same, like. So yeah, I don't know. I find it makes total sense to me how much you managed to take to kind of just with this very kind of specific new stuff, how much kind of, you know, if you use them as the lens, like you can use the modes to look at things differently. You can use these things to look at the interaction between, you know, structures in each mode, and they look very consistent. So
in which what mode?
Like I was very convinced by your idea of looking at the interactions inside the mode, like between clans, inside families, and so on, using this. The thing that I don't know how to connect with, which I feel is it's funny that Dennis presented and then you did, because Dennis working with this type theory thing, which seems to me very much at the frontier between composition and logic, in the sense that it seems like a very rich theory to ask about what counts as a possible input in a structure, right? So like, what is types that are relevant for this little machine, and what things are not properly typed to be like fed into it. So it connects like what gets to be composed together and a kind of predicate logic of what are the propositions, the language that is valid, right? So for example, it's all about explaining why mode A, we are able to speak of kinship, fatherhood, motherhood in certain terms, but not others, because you need to be typed in some ways to actually engage with the logic of that space. That part is not really part of what you're proposing, because in this approach, terms need to come with their types. Like we need to know what fathers, mothers, laborers are. They're not, even though all the properties and the qualities of these terms come from the arrows. So like we're constantly separating like what is inside, what is political, what is not, what is part of the family, what is not, from the arrows. The terms themselves, which give us some indication of what arrows we can draw or not, they are predetermined, right? They're not in the theory. So I feel like there's some intersection between the two things. The question of what counts as an input, which is at the border of what Dennis was doing, and, you know, how the interactions define the space, which is what you're doing. And there's something in between the two that I don't know what it is, but probably something that might facilitate the connection, right, between the two.
Yeah, to think of this homotopy connection more, especially because you're defining like self-identity through these basically like self loops, right? That something that starts at one place, goes around in some way, interacts with something, and how those interactions basically flow back to the whatever individual you're taking into consideration. I think one thing to keep in mind, like as we try to develop this more, is how, like when you were talking about equivalences, right? So when you talk about this era that's like the paths through whatever the father and the mother one way or the other, how different paths could be equivalent in the sense of like pushing one path to another, right? And the like, I guess like the types that like build the self-identity that can be meaningfully distinguished are going to be ones that like don't fall within the equivalent, so like cannot be kind of moved from one to another. So I think that's definitely like a metaphor we want to lean into maybe a little bit. But the more we talk about this and develop this, the more I'm convinced homotopy type theory is going to be the the ultimate world in which this lives in, which like is not, it's like commensurate with everything else. Like it doesn't contradict.
The candidate that I mean we're at the very end of the nerds table here. I know Medium
yeah
is also here, but you know, like we have this thing with composition, interaction, and intelligibility, right? And
exactly,
we were
like
talking
the Trinitarianism.
Yeah, we were talking about these three things, and it looked like how did we draw this, Renzo, last time, where it seemed like composition.
So interaction and intelligibility, I remember was games, right?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, that we ended up with the idea that
so composition and interaction was you said probability, I think.
Yeah, here I found it. Is this thing here we were thinking about? That composition is a lot about mereology, right? So it's about parts and wholes. Intelligibility is all about logic. Interaction seems to have a lot to do with this causal analysis approach. The mixture of parts and wholes with causal analysis seems to be something like probability, right? Given some structure and some sort of possible ways of causing things, right? Dependence is this kind of space of probable causality. The relation between parts and wholes and logic seems to be topology. And we were wondering if the relation between this causal analysis that Renzo is developing and the logical analysis, if it isn't like games, you know, where you have like strategy, agents, parameters for actions, which are kind of, you know, what paths you can take. But it's also very compositional, very much, there's like a whole categorical analysis of games these days, right? Yeah, I mean, I totally stole the idea of organizational Trinitarianism from, you know, the Curry Howard, blah, blah, blah idea. So like programming, programs, proofs, and I forgot what the third is.
Do you want me to quickly go to the last part, or?
Sure.
I don't know if
yeah, go ahead.
People are a bit tired, but just so I don't. Wait, what am I sharing? Where is my screen? Wait, I lost my presentation. Sorry. Okay, found it. I'll go quickly just so that we don't have to. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's something Median was talking about the gestures, and just like finishing with the last concept, which I just had briefly mentioned, of that of which I define as residues, right? Which are these objects that you cannot come back. Yeah, just quickly, the motivation here is a bit like it's sort of like invariant across my sort of like militant experience was this realization that after sort of like 10 years, so like within my friends and like the militant scene, like it's funny that these two texts were written 10 years apart and they are like talking about the same problem of like not being able to sort of like accumulate, and what is left out of all these struggles. Like, so at the time, the problem was like specific to student organizing. So we felt that the secondary school movement was constrained of not being able to sort of like accumulate, like last through time, because it was just the way that school works. Like after 3 years, you have to leave and new people enter. So there's built in the structure of school, this loss of memory, this difficulty in accumulating, and also like this sensation of identity void, which I think is also a really interesting concept of like recurrent experience, this sort of voiding out of like in like autonomous movement, like tend to treat organization like after a struggle as sort of like this empty shell, right? Which sort of like after it's not anymore like connected to some struggle, like when it's when the boundary is not more like effective, the sort of interior becomes voided out from the point of view of the boundary. So there's this experience that, so why do we keep on meeting? Like, are we just like, so maybe we're just like friends, like this space is just like reproducing itself with no reason. It lost its referent, right? So, and this, I thought like I come across to the same problem like in this text, in which this sort of condition is generalized, right? It becomes like a constitutive part of the social world, this sort of like fluidity and disintegration of the world, in which militant activities it sort of only disperses, it never accumulates. So you can only talk about residue. So that's why I think this idea of residue is why I maintained in throughout. And then, yeah, I just wanted to quickly just show this, because there were like these 3 different cases in which you could interact with something without being able to sort of like reproduce yourself, right? So you could make differences without sensing them. You could sense differences without making them, and you could not like make a difference, not sense anything. It's just like something it's out of your like causal purview. And then the problem in terms of like practice becomes a question of like finding objects in which you can make these reproductions obtain, right? So in the case of these limit objects, you can make differences, but you don't sense them. So it's a problem of like sensitivity, of being able to sort of like hear stuff. The case of the petit object is about like you sense stuff without being able to sort of like interact them. So it's a problem of action, right? Of intervention. And in general is generally like a problem of connection. So I think one thing I was also thinking about is how there's this there's this duality between also, I think, the way that political inquiries appear in like militant practice, which has this sort of like outward facing thing, right? It's a lot about like sensing, mapping, sort of like social spaces and properties in a way that, so you're able to sense stuff so that you want to find ways to intervene. So inquiries, like militant inquiries, is not just a matter of just like registering. It's interested in finding out like ways to intervene, right? So new ways to sort of like interact with the world. While I think I don't know if it's experiment is the name, but I think that's something that like it's I think I talked with Gabriel once on this metaphor of, you know, the particle accelerator, right? In how in struggle you can conceive, like it appeared this metaphor of like creating like an accelerator just to see where things go. Like you create this accelerator to make things go fast just to see if you create something new. And I think there is this opposite dimension in science, which is the more like exploratory, investigative experiments, which are like registering, like pointing a telescope to the sky and just trying to sort of like distinguish noise from meaningful like signal. It's a bit different from like building a sort of like bounded space in which you can sort of like produce new particles, right? So it's a different, one is about like discovering stuff out there which you can interact, and the other one is more about like producing stuff by being able to enclose and control for external conditions. So, and I think it sort of maps a bit on, I'm not sure, but on there, you tend to have like the internal like objects tend to be more a problem, because in theory you're able to interact with everything which is inside you, right? But it's normally like a problem of being able to hear and sense the problems, like say like internal to an organization is always often a matter of being able to listen to like the limits of stuff that is being done. Like you are able to do anything, but it's really hard to listen to what's what's happening. While in the case of like inquiries, which are facing like the external world, you are able to sense a lot, but not, the problem is how to interact, right? So it's this problem of these petit objects are outside, tend to be outside, and limit objects tend to be inside. I don't think it's that's
well,
always
perhaps one way to, I mean, just now riffing off the science metaphor, because it seems like the actual distinctions between the role of noise, right? For example, if you create, for example, the particle accelerator, in a certain sense, the sort of statement that came out of it was confirming a lot of crazy predictions, right? So it's because I think the artificial aspect is actually present in both, like in the sense that artificial means you want to be able to establish a meaningful boundary between noise and relevant data, right? So that's present in, if you turn a telescope into the sky and you can't tell apart noise from meaningful data at all, it's also going to be meaningless. So you need to be able to, for example, show that some things transform when you move the telescope to one place or another, and some don't, right? Something like that. But the noise in the telescope, I mean, it's very vague. I'm not sure if this is too much, but it looks like it has the potential of leading you to produce new statements, whereas, you know, these more controlled experiments usually are more about confirming or denying previous predictions. You know, like that might be, perhaps it doesn't map onto particle accelerators versus, you know, cosmological observation, but that might be a meaningful distinction because it gives two roles for noise. Like in the one case, you need to remove noise to see if you can confirm something that was in the air but not fully observed, like almost like prefiguration. You know, we know where we should be going. We just need concrete evidence that it's a meaningful prediction. In the other case, it's not really about prediction, as you said, it's about seeing what happens. And then you don't have the prediction, but perhaps something that you thought was noise is actually a totally new data for the theory. Like that's a very strong distinction between inquiries and experiments, where it almost feels like it's prefigurative experiments and more investigative experiments, right? Something like that.
Yeah, I think, and it's also, but I think there's an it's the opposite from science, because like scientific investigations is more a problem. Maybe I'm wrong, but in investigations, you're able to what was the argument here? Like, yeah, because here in politics, I'm saying that the problem is interacting in the case of inquiries, but often it's a problem of sensing in the case of science, while the problem, like in the sort of like enclosed experiments, is sort of like interacting the right way, right? To be able to.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that I think the insight you had with this distinction here, that experiment concerns the internal space, whereas inquiry concerns the boundary, is that that's two places for noise, right? Noise in an interior, you want noise to go away so that the interior can reproduce. So meaning the theory can be confirmed. Prefiguration has that feeling as well. Like we want to show now that something that was supposed to happen in the future is possible, but we already had a statement about the future, right? Whereas boundary has to do with the limiting, like putting some of the noise in, moving some of the noise out. So let's say the function of the noise is not determined yet. It might actually be where the new stuff is coming from. Whereas in the interior, it's unlikely that the noise is going to play a more active role. I'm just trying to see if the boundary versus interior is not the, the core term to make the distinction.
Yeah. I think it's more important than I think it's just vaguely correlate these two kinds of objects. But at the end, I think it's more about the boundaries. Like the function of the boundaries is different, right? In both cases.
Can we not say along what you were saying before, kind of think about like what the like hypothesis of a political experiment would be? Is it not something like, I guess like something like the intents, but not the individual intents of like the collective of people that participate in it? Something like a sheaf of intents, no? Like what people are trying to achieve. Not that that's like realistic or anything, and something else could happen, right? But there is still something that when people are doing something, that there is almost like an expected outcome, no?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, for example, the difference
even
for
if
me
it's
is like,
less like clear to, it's not always obvious what it is.
yeah, but like just think of the analogy like this, right? Higgs says that there is a particle that people don't know exists, but it should be there because of the theory. You build an experiment and you confirm the Higgs boson, right? Versus you point a telescope to the sky, like a weird, crazy telescope, and there is noise, the same amount of noise, the same type of noise, every direction. Like that's not accounted for. So now you need a theory for why there could be noise coming from everywhere homogeneously in the universe. Like that's a boundary experiment, in my opinion. And the first is an internal one. Like the Higgs boson needs to exist for the theory to remain consistent. So that's the interior of the theory, which is being confirmed. Whereas having to account for, homogeneous universe noise is actually a new challenge for the theory. Like there might not even be predictions for what it is. And then you need to kind of accommodate it, right? So it's expanding, right? In a certain sense. So it makes a lot of sense because both do concern boundaries. Like one seems to be from the boundary to the inside, like to make sure the internal space keeps kind of steady, right? It should confirm its predictions. Whereas the second is obliged to make new predictions, revise things, expand, because it's moving the boundary somewhere else, right? So like for me, the analogy with politics has something to do like being able to use, the new values, idea of justice inside the occupations to solve problems in the occupations. It's going to give further credence to the idea that schools could be run in different ways. That's the internal remaining consistent. Whereas, staging a meeting with, the garbage workers to see if you can include a new waste disposal system into the school so you don't rely on, the mayor or other forces. That's expanding the boundary, like something that could be noise, could be residue, could be waste. You're trying to replace it, right? Put it in a new position, and it's not even accounted for in the, students movement that you should have a position on that. Suddenly you need to have, right? So like one seems more like a consistent experiment, like the theory is consistent, this prediction must be true. So if the student movement has new values, a conflict should be solvable in new terms. Whereas the second seems investigative in the sense that you are welcoming more noise. There's some danger to it, right? Something like that.
There's just I have 3 slides left, and then
no, let's do it, man. I'm up. We need to.
For completeness. I came across, I remember actually, like, this is a small like anecdote, like in grad, like in, no, when I was an undergrad in this, I had these classes on, what's the name, like complex, no, it's what, like, what an analytic space is. This is like complex analysis, I think. Yeah, it was this subject I never fully like.
Complex analysis, probably, yeah.
Yeah, it was super abstract. I didn't understand, but like,
We're talking about like analytic continuation and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it was terrible.
Yep.
Like, it was a terrible experience, but it made it made
It's a
me
beautiful
remember
subject. Oh, the residue theorem. Yeah, yeah.
of this theorem, which is like, it's really beautiful if you like reinterpret in terms of, it basically says that for when you have like this analytic space, no, when you have, what's it called? Yeah, analytic
yeah.
space.
In the complex plane, when you have a function that is on the entire plane, that you can take derivatives of and things. Basically, it allows you to just by going around something, essentially, you can, just by like counting the amount of times you loop around singular points, you can compute like your integrals around the entire thing.
Yeah.
So it's just like it collapses everything just by how it's called the residue theorem. I'm not sure exactly.
It's because the points are called the residues, which are the places where the space is non-analytic, which is really funny. Like it's called also singular points. So you have an analytic space, and this integral across just like this closed integral, you can basically reduce it to just like counting the points which are non-analytic, right? Which are the singular point, and just summing them. And that gives you the integral. So and you can, and the proof is also nice. Like you just encircle, you're just like able to encircle these points and show that that's all that matters. But I think it's a nice metaphor, at least, to like how to think about like this problem of the ending, the sort of like ebbing of struggles, in which you just sort of like try to collect the sort of residues of what's left, and that's the only thing that matters to sort of like. Yeah.
It's also related to the whole like equivalence of paths, that if you push these paths around, as long as you don't hop over a point, it's going to be exactly the same, because it's only counting how many times it goes around the point.
Wait, you related it to the thing previous or no?
I'm just kind of generally relating it to the example of homotopy in general, where you're thinking of paths as equivalent, as long as you can like push one to another one without deforming things or tearing things, right? So here, basically what it's saying is that the integral around this path is completely determined around how many times it winds around or goes around completely each one of these residue points, of which there's always finitely many. So you can compute this like weird, crazy infinite integral thing in a finite way. But it doesn't matter which path you actually take. This is how it's related to like conservative, like vector fields, like for example, like in like gravitation and things. But it's also why it comes up so much in science. Like electromagnetism is all defined by complex analysis.
Right, when you compute
but the interesting thing is that like the path itself does not matter. It's what the path encapsulates. So you can, as long as you push the path, you can stretch it and wiggle it as much as you want, as long as you don't like bring the path over a point continuously, then it's the same, which is just relevant.
And yeah, just a summary, then a summary of everything before. Yeah, I think I wasn't able to do it without like crossing stuff over itself. I even tried to like do like 3D versions, but it didn't work also. So it's just a summary of, then that's what I mentioned medium, because medium mentioned the gestures. So inquiries would be related to this problem of finding right, gestures that make you incorporate new stuff. Experimenting would be experimenting with the limits, internal limits of the movement, and you could call it places, this sort of like internal space. And yeah, I just applying this to the case study from the beginning. You could sort of like map this sort of, you had like 3 stages, right, of the movement. The students in the street process, dispersed in the protest, then the idea of occupying, which consolidated like a new space and an internal space of the movement. Then the second stage in which, and last stage in which the blockade tactic was sort of like proposed, and which reorganized the internal space again. So you can think of like how the beginning, like Mal Educado plays this role of this sort of like thing that sort of like you had like this blocked interaction in which, and it sort of like found this gesture of occupying, which became in the second stage like an internal space. And you sort of like repeat like how the commando coordinates this sort of like the internal limits of the space of occupations, and while you still have to sort of like look for the next, investigate for new like actions and components that can be integrated, while the occupation, it was more, as we were saying, like a matter of putting to test new values of what, you know, like of a different sort of like education that students were wanting, right? Yeah.
Fuck. That's a bit, look, I honestly, like the 2 things that I really wanted to, I mean, we can just meet up later, you can explain them a bit better. I think they are connected, I'm not really clear on how, but like there's this whole thing we discussed today about the, you know, how to write this difference between simple and expanded reproduction arrows and whatever. Like it seems to me that it's more just a way of writing that I don't follow exactly, or that perhaps could be made more clear. But the second thing, which I also really want to learn a bit better, because it seems to be that it goes in the very interesting direction, but it doesn't, at least for now, it doesn't have the same kind of very intuitive benefit that everything else I think has, which is this 3 kind of limit operations you define when you don't get a reaction, or you get the reaction but no cause. Like those 3 things, they seem, I mean, for example, you mobilize them to define the gestures, right? That's a bit obscure to me yet. Like I feel like I'm gonna rewatch the first meeting as well, but like I have the impression that in those 2 points, the self-relating arrows do a lot of work, you know, like, and for example, it might make sense because, you know, the object A for Lacan has everything to do with something that gets in the way of your self arrow, but it doesn't get in the way because it comes from the outside, but because it comes from the inside, right? So it's a partial subset, like it's a subset of yourself, but that you need to exclude it to say that you're relating to yourself. And when you bring that subset back, then you don't, you know? So, I mean, the very fact that there was something about how you intervene, like there is a difference, but there's nothing that went outward. It seems like you're touching on something similar, like, and it's interesting because for Lacan, it had to do with, I think he had a poorer theory than Badiou on this point, because for Lacan, the things that are internal but get in the way of your self-identity, the best thing you can do with them is learn to live with them. They're like a closed black box. The object A is like a black box. It's so other, it's not even outside of you, which would give it more determination. So it's pure otherness. So you can't really talk about changing it, doing anything to it, because that would imply it's not so absolutely other, right? And Badiou turned that into this sort of minimal resolution where there is stuff inside that black box. You're just not seeing it. And I feel that's where you want to take gestures from. Like,
yeah, I totally.
Right. I mean, there's something like it. like this,
yeah.
this arrow in the A here going to itself, where a difference appears, but you didn't really make it, right? It comes from, it was supposed to not have a form, but there is a form there anyway that emerges somehow, right? Like somebody hears about occupations being the proper way to go forward. It's kind of an empty form that it's in the right place at the right time and kind of emerges without anybody like purposely acting to produce that specific thing. So there's something there that I think I get the intuition behind, but it is connected with the other thing we were talking about that looks like we could like just polish how it appears, you know?
Yeah, totally agree.
But it's, man, I don't know. I think it's a lot of really, really, really cool new stuff to think about. But probably it's, you know, I think that in this kind of logical approach to parts and wholes, it's slightly easier, like the way Badiou did it, because he says, well, there's something in an object which is not formed or not typed to play a role in that world, but it's there nonetheless. And contingently, we can actually kind of start connecting parts of the world based on that kind of anonymous gesture, right? But it's like a visually, it's kind of intuitive, the idea that you have some sort of black box that functions like this kind of indistinct aspect, and then you suddenly open it a bit and interact with its inside in this more interactive way, where terms seem to have to be predetermined to appear. Like the terms are the terms, the relations are the relations. You would need to have a way to talk about how something which is meaningless, we don't interact with it, so, or we always interact in the same way, suddenly we can split it into its parts, and those parts we get to interact in new ways, right? Like you interact with workers as labor power, and workers interact with each other as labor power to some degree, but they might open that black box and interact with each other as, you know, meaningful strategists or cooperative people or families or whatever. And in that new interaction, they change who they are, right? So that the reproduction issue of how to write that, and this kind of the issue of how to write down the gestures, and the fact that there is some self-transformation to something which is not the actor, right? They seem connected. Like probably what will solve one thing in the formalism will also solve the other, I have the impression. But again, I feel like it's not a matter of intuition, because I get the intuition behind it. It's more a matter of probably how to put it down, you know? But it's something, I don't know.
I think I tried to more or less cover that with postulating, right? That if the space is like that, you're guaranteed that it exists, right? This sort of, oh, where was it? Yeah, here.
Yeah.
That you can find that those objects exist. But one direction I thought about is how to connect this to scales, right? Which the problem of resolutions. When you try to bundle, like it seems related, right? How to coarse graining and sort of like fine graining objects.
Yeah, definitely.
So
and I mean,
like,
and that perhaps those three problems should be solved together, like simple reproduction, that kind of expanded version where you transform in the process, the issue of, you know, interacting passively with something and then interacting in such a way that the response is a difference you didn't intend to make, like a new difference comes from within the black box. And the waste issue, because the waste issue has a lot to, is the clearest one to do with scaling, because, I mean, garbage is a relative term, right? I mean, it's garbage because I put it in my bin and I don't know what's done with it. Like that I've put a boundary at this level, and it's meant not to connect with my reality anymore. It's what makes it garbage. If I had to care for the whole circuit that it takes from my house to the waste disposal area, becoming renewable energy, being used to light somebody's lamp, it's not really waste in the same sense, right? It's just part of this paths.
Mhm.
In the same way that private consumption by capitalists is like waste, but if you zoom out, it's actually necessary for the reproduction of what Marx calls department theory of total capital. So every time you have a waste, it looks like it requires you to expand. So it might be that, you know, this kind of wasteful aspects of, like, from the standpoint of capital, workers having a life is just waste. Like, it just looks like energy you're not spending at work, right? But the moment that you take that energy no longer as wasteful energy, but as the kind of underground reproduction sphere of family, friends, mutual aid, so on, you're obliged to zoom out from the factory to like a larger community, right?
Mhm.
And in a certain sense, that seems implied in Badiou's idea that the moment that you find something in a strong singularity, you are obliged to enrich your world in order to account for it, right? So you only thought about paint as the material support for figures, but suddenly you realize you can do abstract painting where textures matter. You still can do figuration, but now there's this richer thing. So you're obliged to expand in a way, right? So the three terms seem connected, like waste, gestures, and this kind of enriched reproduction.
Yeah.
So probably there is something there, you know? Because I also feel like I mean, that's also what makes it an ecological theory, not an economic theory. Like, I feel like economy, you set up boundaries based on, for example, value, and that will give you the boundary for everything. Like, if it's not valuable, it's not part of it, right? Whereas from the standpoint of struggle, you're always challenging, no, that thing that doesn't look as part of the economy is actually part of the reproduction of this system, right? So ecology looks like you're obliged to track wastes, whereas economy, you're allowed to have wastes, right? For economical perspective, you're allowed to not give a shit about where nuclear waste goes. From the ecological point of view, you need to track the waste relations the best you can, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
right. I mean, you could definitely bring that distinction into politics, like the ecological view of politics, you're obliged to actually track down interactions, where the economical view of politics would be like, okay, parties are politics and everything else is just outside, right? Or trade unions are politics, everything else is just outside.
Yeah, and the fact that, like, this arrow, which is the arrow of surplus value, right? It's only when you get to track it that is stopped. Otherwise, it's waste, right? It's unaccounted waste, surplus value. It's only when you're able to sort of track the ecology of capital and work that you.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually when surplus, which has this wasteful connotation, becomes profit, which is no longer a name for waste. It's a name for a specific entity in the economic world, right?
Right, but that's from the of capital, right?
Yeah. I'm just saying, like, even from that perspective, like, you're obliged to zoom out to turn private consumption of capitalists into part of the system, right? But it's, so I don't know. I feel like all these problems are very connected. I feel like there might be a way to be very elegant about how to describe them together, you know, within this kind of path focused formalism. But it's still, I feel like there are some things that became so intuitive when you put them in these terms. Those are the things that are on the fringe of intuition, you know, like probably like there will be nice things to develop there.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Dude, but this was really, really cool. I need to.
Yeah, thanks for bringing paths into our work.
Thanks
yes, now everything will be a path, like, for me. I'm just.
Yeah, that's my goal.
That's my new goal. Yasha, see you in a couple of days, man.
Yes, I'll see you
Wednesday, I guess.
Thursday, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, Thursday.
Cool. We'll be in touch.
See you, Renzo.
See ya. Have a safe flight and everything.
Thanks.
Thanks.